Please have your attention. I'm Chuck Boyd. For those of you who are maybe here for the first time, I'm the chairman of the board and of this wonderful little think tank, and I'll be your moderator for today. As a young man, a young fighter pilot, I went out to the Philippines a long time ago. And as a romantic young fellow, I went out there thinking that I was following in the footsteps of my grandfather, who had gone out there in 1898 with Arthur MacArthur, to consolidate on land what Dewey had consolidated in the Bay of Manila. And it was a wonderful time. It was, and I managed to get all over that region. I spent 1 week out of every 4 in Taiwan, sitting alert. I flew out of and exercised on the new air bases that had been built in Thailand, Karat and Takli, Uban, Udorn, in anticipation of a war that everybody believed was coming. I flew with Australians out of in the Malay Peninsula, out of Penang, and the Brits in Singapore. Brits were east of Suez in those days, and the guys that I dealt with thought they always would be. And then, I think, with the exception of a brief interlude back in the States where I checked out in a different airplane and then went off to Turkey for a little while. But for the next 12 years, essentially, I spent in this region, the South China Sea and the area around it. I got caught up in the vortices of the Vietnam War, of course, and stayed there for the duration. When I left, I had no intention of going back. But history moves on, and if you devote your life, as I did to mine, to various aspects of this nation's security apparatus, you can't ignore this piece of geography that we're going to talk about today. And so I've gone back, and I'll continue to go back. My paths crossed with our speaker today about 15 years ago, as I recall, when I was the executive director of the Hart-Rudman Pension Commission, and we were trying to figure out, as our charter required of us, to figure out what kind of a world we're going to live in over the next quarter of a century, and what kind of a national security apparatus would be appropriate to that world for the security of the nation. And the third volume was the how to modify the structures and the processes by which the nation formulates and executes its national security policies and foreign policies appropriate to that strategy and in that world. And we went all over the world in 28 countries and met with prime ministers and presidents and foreign ministers and defense ministers and finance ministers and journalists and academics and what have you. But 3 people out of all that period kind of stood out in my mind, and one of them was Madame Ogata, who was many of you know, I'm sure, was that wonderful Japanese lady who was at the time the High Commissioner for UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and she drilled into our heads that the security phenomenon for the first quarter of century was going to be one of fragmentation, was already, and was going to continue to be fragmentation along ethnic and racial and religious and national lines, and the displacement of people that would cause, and the disruptions and the instability as a result. A scholar whose name I've sadly forgotten, an Egyptian scholar, one night in Cairo, with a telling sentence or two said the problem that you have to face, your country will have to face in the 21st century is managing the most important problem related to your security is how to manage resentment. Because everybody resents you, your friends, your enemies alike. Managing that in some way is going to be important. We had a Secretary of State that was going around the world telling people that we were the one indispensable nation, and in the process angering virtually everybody. The third person that really stood out in my mind was a fellow that came and talked to us and spent a day with us and said, your problem is what you must create is the ability to deal with instability, to be the stabilizing force both in your foreign and security policies. And forget about trying to impose your values or whatever on other nations. Just worry about stability, because your interests ultimately can only be served in a stable world. You won't have enough resources, he said, to tamp down all the instability, so pick the places that really matter. And one of the places that really matters is the one we're going to talk about today. I think it was Ed Blutbach who said, in describing John Keegan, my favorite military historian, he writes like an angel. To me, Robert Kaplan writes like a devil. He lures the reader. He entices the reader. He seduces the reader into turning the page to find out what's on the next page and the next and the next. He's a master at that. And he's going to tell us today about Asia's cauldron. We're privileged to have you, sir.
Well, thank you so much, Chuck, for that lovely introduction, really a lovely introduction. And it's a great pleasure and privilege to be here at the Center for the National Interest and at the National Interest magazine, which I put my money where my mouth is. I'm a paid subscriber. I read every article in it, and I follow the activities of the Center profoundly, and I follow the website profoundly. I don't always agree with it, but I think in a world where so much of opinion is rightly or wrongly liberal internationalist or rightly or wrongly neoconservative, it's very important to have a classical realist voice and a debate among classical realists that writers can go to, that readers can go to get what I think may not be the opinion often in the media, but is quietly the opinion I have found in the halls of government, whether it's the Pentagon, the CIA, the State Department, the NSC, etc. With that in mind, let me begin. When you read the elite op-ed pages, whether it's the conservative Wall Street Journal or the liberal New York Times or some that are less easy to define, you think you're getting different points of view. In fact, in some ways you are, but in another way you're not. Because all of this opinion that you tend to get tends to err on the side that we can do anything. If only we had the right policy, the right generals in place, the right structure in place, we could turn this situation in that country to rights and that situation in that country to rights. If only we had done this 3 years ago, it would all be much better now in this place. And the argument is about how to do that. But the idea that there may be constraints or limitations, tragic ones, upon leaders of whatever party is sometimes lost in this, in this flood of opinion that churns out, blaming people, trying to get people to do this, then blaming them when it doesn't come out the way someone wanted it to be. I'm not going to take issue with that today. There's a lot of good in that every single day. What I'm going to talk about is the other 50% of reality, constraints. And when it comes to constraints, tragic constraints upon leaders, I'm going to talk about geography, not in terms of just a map, but in the classic 19th century sense of the word, in terms of the map is merely a starting point for an understanding of trade routes, natural resources, distribution of populations, urban and rural, of cultural attitudes and traits. Because after all, what is a culture? A culture is the shared experience of a people on a specific geography for hundreds of thousands of years that leads to commonalities in music, art, in language and various other things. If all countries in the world were if everyone was just a pure individual bouncing off each other in a global meeting hall, then every country in the world would have the same foreign policy. But it obviously doesn't. They have different foreign policies based on their geographical, in the 19th century sense of the word, situation. And in talking about geography today, I'm going to hone in on one area of the world, East Asia, and then narrow it even more to the South China Sea. Let me start with China. A lot of people in this room are experts on China. You can have a very sophisticated discussion about China. Let me talk about China in the way that I would talk about it to like a 12 or a 15-year-old boy or girl. What would I say about China? I would say, number one, China lies in the temperate zone. The northernmost part of China, Harbin in Manchuria, is about the same latitude as Maine. The southernmost part of China, Hainan Island in the South China Sea, is about the same latitude as the Florida Keys. China has 9,000 kilometers or so of coastline. Fronting the Pacific, where the main sea lines of communication converge. Coastline not in the northern Arctic like Russia's practically useless northern coast, but coastline in the temperate and subtropical zones. So in some ways, China is like the United States. It has immense geographical possibilities. It's not purely an accident that China had for most of history great civilizations and empires, interrupted by 175 years or so of domination by the West and the Japanese and others in the 19th and early 20th century. A lot of this has to do with where China happens to be located on the map. And China has a continental geography. When the Grand Canal was built in the 7th century, linking the Yangtze and Yellow rivers, it was roughly equivalent to the building of the Transcontinental Railroad for the United States in the 19th century. So that China is more than a country. It's a continent. It's a continent and it's an empire inside of a country, much like the United States. Because what were the western part of America, west of the Mississippi, and particularly west of the Missouri, for much of history before they were states? They were part of an empire ruled from Washington, D.C. as territories. Abraham Lincoln, in this sense, was an imperial president. And so were others after him until the whole lower 48 were incorporated into states. It's the same with China in the far west, where what we now call Xinjiang province didn't really become part of China to the degree that other places were part of China until the mid-19th century, which is extremely late in Chinese history. Now, when Chinese leaders look at their geography, however, they look at it quite differently than we look at ours, because geography tells many stories, and I just told you one superficial level. Another way to look at Chinese geography, if you're in the Politburo or on the Standing Committee, is we may be very big, but really we're surrounded. We're in a claustrophobic setting. Forget about what lies outside China. Let's just talk about what's inside China's boundaries. In the north, you have Inner Mongolians. In the west, you have Muslim Turkic Uyghurs. In the southwest, you have Tibetans, all of whom live on high plateaus, often rich with natural resources, especially water in the case of Tibet. The Dalai Lama is not just a spiritual figure, he's a geopolitical figure, because Tibet controls the headwaters of the Brahmaputra and other rivers that flow into Bangladesh and India. And without that band that surrounds the arable lowland ethnic Han cradle of China, that ethnic Han cradle in the center and on the Pacific coast cannot survive because it doesn't have enough water, it doesn't have enough resources. So Chinese leaders have to be very concerned that what would liberalization bring? What would political liberalization bring? In the West, we say, well, it will bring democracy, and that'll be wonderful. But if you're sitting in Beijing, you say it may lead to sustained ethnic turbulence of a sort much more severe than what we've experienced so far. So that the fear that Chinese leaders have of liberalization is quite real, and that to me is the ultimate geographic challenge of China, how to liberalize over the coming decades while maintaining stability and peace in the very resource-rich ethnic borderlands, all within China. So China looks smaller on the map if you're a leader of China. It also looks bigger. And here I get into the centerpiece of my story. In the north, China has 100 million people in Manchuria, but just over the border in the resource-rich Russian Far East with timber, diamonds, gold, and other resources, you have only 7 million people, and a population that's going to go down to 4.5 million people over the coming decades. So China is ripe for expansion into the Russian Far East. In the far west, China has been building roads, pipelines, and rail networks throughout the former republics of the Soviet Union, bringing Kazakh oil into western China, Turkmen natural gas into western China. And of course, in Southeast Asia, China exercises, to the degree that it can, a divide and conquer strategy of dealing with each country separately so it doesn't have to deal with ASEAN as a whole. All of this leads to the idea that China is bigger than it looks on the map. It's not only smaller than it looks on the map, it's also bigger than it looks on the map because it has great possibilities for power projection. And the place where it looks biggest, perhaps, is its marginal adjacent seas, the South China and the East China Seas. Let me call the South China Sea the Asian Mediterranean. And let me refer to the Greater Caribbean, meaning the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean proper, as the American Mediterranean. That just as the Caribbean is central to the New World, the South China Sea and the East China Sea are central to the Old World, or central to the navigable maritime rimland of the Old World that stretches from the Horn of Africa all the way around Indonesia to north to the Sea of Japan. That it is really the center, the nexus of it, if you will. And I remember once I had a conversation with a Chinese senior colonel who looked at me and he said, look, how can you at all as an American criticize anything we're doing in the South China Sea? Because we are doing nothing different than what you Americans did in the Caribbean in the 19th and early 20th century. Remember that the 19th and the early 20th century in America, when if you were a foreign policy honcho, you often wanted to be a specialist on the Caribbean. Not on the Middle East. The Middle East, the Caribbean was not a place for vacations then. It was a place where significant foreign policy decisions were hatched and determined. And the Monroe Doctrine was not just about kicking the Europeans out. It was more subtle than that. It was about freezing a status quo that had suddenly become favorable to the young United States. It was about the Europeans had already left in most part, and the Monroe administration just didn't want to see them back in the same capacity. And even after the Monroe Doctrine was announced, the United States kept cooperating with the British Royal Navy in the Caribbean to combat the slave trade. And gaining gradual control over the greater Caribbean allowed the United States not to confront Europe in any negative form, but to move closer to Europe diplomatically in Europe itself, now that the Caribbean had been taken care of. Now, there was a great American geopolitical thinker who died young in the early 1940s when he was 43 years old, Nicholas Spikeman, who taught at Yale. And Spikeman said that the New World, the Western Hemisphere, is not divided between North America and South America. It's divided between north of the Amazonian jungle and south of the Amazonian jungle. It's the Amazonian jungle that's the real barrier in the Western Hemisphere, because countries like Venezuela, Guyana, Colombia, they may technically be in South America, but most of their people live on the Caribbean coast. So they're Caribbean countries more than South American countries. So that once the young United States gradually gained control of the greater Caribbean, it essentially achieved mastery of the hemisphere. And once it had achieved mastery of the hemisphere, it was then able to affect the balance of power in the other hemisphere. And that's what the history of the 20th century was all about. The United States being a pivotal power in 2 world wars and the Cold War, but it all began with the Caribbean. And same with the South China Sea for China, perhaps. The South China Sea does a lot for China. First of all, it's a natural shield. It's blue national soil for China because it's a natural, organic blue water extension of their continental landmass, to the same degree that the Caribbean is to the continental landmass of the United States. In fact, it's roughly the same size. And with mastery of the South China Sea, China has far more easy access to the Indian Ocean on one direction and to the wider Pacific in the other direction. The Indian Ocean is interesting. The Chinese are trying to move south, financing or helping to build or building ports in Bagamoyo in Tanzania, in Hambantota in Sri Lanka, in Kayukfru in Burma, in Gwadar in Pakistan. I've actually visited most of these ports. I did a long reporting study of Gwadar, spending over a week there 5 years ago for the Atlantic Monthly, because I feel what's going on there is so subtle. You just can't write about it from far away. You have to go there and see it. And what I found in Gwadar was that the Chinese have a very long way to go. Gwadar may look great. The only problem is everywhere around it is totally unstable and unsafe. And you have a Baluch separatist movement. You have a possibility of a coming apart Pakistani state. So that Gwadar is a future prospect for China. Yes, it built it, and yes, it's now taken over running the port from the Singaporeans, but they haven't done much with it, and they may not for a very long time. Kayukfru in Myanmar is very different. That's already operating. They've built a pipeline that will take natural gas through northern and central Myanmar into southern China. Hambantota in Sri Lanka is already operating. It's different in each port. Keep in mind, does this constitute a new Chinese naval empire? No, it doesn't. First of all, empires begin or slowly in your sleep, as it will. As I wrote, the Venetian Empire began as a small expedition against pirates in the northern Adriatic in 1000 A.D. The empires of the Dutch East India Company, the British East India Company began in a very modest way, and nobody was ever sure where it was going at ever one point. All you see now in the greater Indian Ocean is a kind of a nascent mercantile empire of sorts that may develop into something, or maybe it will not, and I'll get to that later. But the South China Sea is key, because without domination of the South China Sea, the Chinese cannot hope to make an end run around Taiwanese sovereignty, and they cannot hope to have unimpeded access to the Indian Ocean, which is the world's hydrocarbon interstate and encompasses the entire arc of Islam, from the Sahara Desert to the Malay Archipelago. Now, what does domination mean? Do they kick us out? Do they have World War II, Battle of the Philippine Sea style battles with the United States Navy? No. The last thing the Chinese want is to have any conflict with the United States. The last thing they want is to get into a shooting war with the United States, because they will lose. They are decades behind our Navy, and I won't go into, but a Navy is not just platforms. It's not just buying an aircraft carrier, buying submarines. One thing I learned as an embedded reporter on both submarines and guided missile destroyers is that it's all about seamanship. It's all about training 330 young people in the case of a destroyer, 185 young people in the case of an attack submarine, and getting them all to do very complex tasks quietly and in unison together, and then coordinating everything they do with other destroyers and maybe even a carrier in a carrier strike group, adding up to thousands upon thousands of young people. And this takes a generation or two, if not more, to really, there are things the U.S. Navy can do that no other Navy in the world can do. And so it's going to take the Chinese a long while to catch up. And that's assuming they keep progressing as they are, and beware of linear projections. Nevertheless, what they seek to do, it seems, is to diminish the ability of the U.S. Navy to go where it wants, wherever it wants, anytime it wants. Anti-access area denial is a neat technical phrase, but it's very subtle. It could mean everything as subtle as just affecting the decision-making of a particular commander of a destroyer into deciding what course he takes, because he doesn't want a confrontation with the Chinese. Whereas 15 years before, when the Chinese Navy was far weaker, he wouldn't have thought that. He wouldn't have had to take that into consideration. That's real power, affecting the decision-making process of your adversary. And it can get very, very subtle. What the Chinese seem to seek is, number one, to Finlandize, an overworked word in the last few weeks in the media, but nevertheless it works, to Finlandize Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, etc., because Finlandization for the Soviet Union worked very well. Didn't cost them all that much, and they didn't get involved in Finnish internal politics very much, but they essentially were able to circumscribe Finland's foreign policy for decades. It was a lot more successful form of imperialism than the Warsaw Pact, which cost the Soviets a fortune to maintain over time, and where they did have to get involved in internal politics. This is what the Chinese want to do. They seem to want to compromise the sovereignty of these Southeast Asian countries based on their actions, based on their threats, and they want to do it without any confrontation with the United States, while still understanding the rules of engagement with the United States so they don't step over any line in this respect. Now, doing this, avoiding a confrontation in the South China Sea, which is the subject of my book, The South China Sea, is actually less dangerous a situation, I think, than the one in the East China Sea at the moment, which is not the subject of my book, but which I'll spend a minute or two on. Japan is a serious ally of the United States. You know, the highest range of allies is treaty allies. In Asia, I believe we have three: Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines. But they're not all equal. Japan is now servicing U.S. nuclear-powered carrier strike groups for the United States. There are tens of thousands of uniformed Americans in Japan. Japan's the third largest world economy after being the second largest for decades. It's a serious country. And were China and Japan to get into a military conflict that may be merely an escalation from an incident that got out of control, it would be harder for the United States to stay out than if, say, that China were to get involved in a conflict with the Philippines. Because while the Philippines is a treaty ally, it's a weakly institutionalized, poverty-stricken state that had already kicked U.S. troops out in the early 1990s, though it's inviting them back in now, and is less a country than a ramshackle empire, as I write, where where an elite in Luzon in the north govern millions of very poor and underprivileged Muslims in Jolo and Basilan, in the whole archipelago in Mindanao and south of Mindanao. The United States is less likely, all things being equal, to get into a conflict with China over the Philippines than one, say, with Japan, which is very serious. In other words, if you could imagine a future 20 years hence where the United States still has a formidable Navy in the Pacific, but the Pacific is no longer an American naval lake, but a truly multipolar military area, to go along with it being already a multipolar diplomatic and economic area. If you could imagine that, with China being the first among equals in the South and East China Seas, because remember, what Asians tell me is America is an interesting geopolitical concept, but China is a fact of life. China is the geographical, economic, military to come organizing principle of all of East Asia. And as a Chinese student said to me, he said, look, the South and East China Seas are just extensions of our country. Being there, we're just exercising benevolence. But when you Americans come from half a world away, you're exercising hegemony. In other words, it's not about ideas. It's not about lofty principles. It's about geography and territorial lines on a blue water map. Who controls what where? And people hold these issues very dear. In the Philippines, if you go there, they know they're a poor country. They know they're weakly institutionalized. And they see that the presumed oil and natural gas in and around the Spratly Islands is one of their tickets to moving their country from just a poor country to a middle-class country. And so, there's a really fierce Filipino nationalism. I don't have to tell you about the fierce Vietnamese nationalism. The Vietnamese essentially want, without saying so, to have more U.S. warships close to their coast and more U.S. fighter jet platforms near them. They don't love us. They find us useful as a balancer against China. They fought one war with the United States, over a dozen with China. And China is near, and thus a geographical fact with which they must deal. And the United States is not coming back to haunt them from half a world away again. So their real fear is China, is Vietnam. Vietnam's real fear is China, and we can be useful for them. So although they're not a treaty ally, they're a very useful de facto ally. And let me say again that Vietnam is 90 million people. Very strategic coastline on the South China Sea. It's a future maritime middle-level power like Turkey if it can get its economic and political reforms in order, which over time it might. A few summing up facts here. None of this in East Asia is about ideas. In other words, it's not about much that's argued in the opinion pages. It's about nationalism. It's about geography. It's about lines in the map. Nationalism is strong and virile in Asia. It's an ethnic nationalism. It's exclusivistic. And that leads to the second thing, that sustained capitalist growth need not necessarily lead to universal values. What it's more likely to lead to, in the words of Paul Bracken at Yale, is military acquisition. Because as decades of economic prosperity kick in, a country finds itself with more interests around the world, trading interests, and then it obviously wants a military to help protect those interests, in addition to just achieving status. The young United States became a great country, a great power between the end of the Civil War and the Spanish-American War, World War I, take your pick. It was in those quiet decades of forgettable one-term presidents that we became a great power because of just constant economic expansion that was not dramatic at any one moment, but which over time was. And what did we do with that? We built a great Navy. We enlarged and codified our Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. China is following a similar path. China is not a rogue state. Its emergence on the world scene is very natural. It's very organic. The bilateral relationship with China is probably the most important in the 21st century in terms of preserving world peace. Other things. The pivot to Asia, which gets a lot of controversy. The pivot, in my mind, should have happened in 1989 after the Berlin Wall fell. What happened was Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. We dislodged him from Kuwait. The Navy and the Air Force got partly, just diverted with a no-fly zone over Iraq for 12 long years. 9/11, invasion of Afghanistan, invasion of Kuwait, of Iraq. We leave Iraq, we're leaving Afghanistan, and we're back to Asia, where we were 25 years later. And the pivot was never meant to be Asia's more important necessarily than the Middle East or Europe. It was meant to say, even though we're winding down two wars, we're not going to go isolationist like we did after previous wars. We're going to pivot to another part of the world rather than go neo-isolationist or something. So it's less of a dramatic and brilliant policy than it's made out to be, and less controversial, I think. In none of this of what I said am I predicting a war. I'm not saying, I don't think war is in the offing. I think what I am predicting is a more crowded, nervous, complicated world, especially on the high seas, because globalization is all about the increase in merchant sea traffic. Another thing, don't take Asian security for granted. For too many decades, war reporters went to the Middle East and Africa, for instance, or the Balkans, and guys in business suits went to Asia, and flew business class. Asia is also a military environment that's increasingly unstable. Also, all countries are pushing out. We had these maritime disputes in the 60s, 70s, but it was never in the newspaper. Why? Because China was internally occupied with the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, bad things, the new economic mechanism of Deng Xiaoping, a good thing. Vietnam was involved in wars. Malaysia, formerly Malaya, was involved in wars. Japan was in a quasi-pacifistic state. So all these places were internally preoccupied. But what's happened is, as they institutionalized and became stronger states and came to be at peace, they built up their militaries, especially China. And when China started building a great navy, Japan slid out of quasi-pacifism. And so they all started projecting power outward, and lo and behold, these long-time maritime disputes mean more than they did decades ago. Finally, last thing. If you were to ask me what is the most intriguing question in the world today, a single issue question, you can't go beyond a single issue, I would not say, will Iran get a nuke or not? I would not say, will Vladimir Putin take over eastern Ukraine or not? I would say the direction of the Chinese economy. because the Chinese economy sits atop a vast credit bubble, a vast housing bubble. Chinese statistics lie. I don't believe its growth rate is 7.5%. I think it's lower. I think when you read economists on this, and I obsessively read them even though I'm not an economist, nobody's in agreement. And some people, substantial people, are predicting a total collapse, like all this. Now, if China muddles through, and its growth rate goes down a bit, it has some disturbances, more disturbances in the West, more political unrest. It just is in a neither-nor state for a decade or so. Its military will keep expanding, and it will become even more nationalistic as a way to dissuade people away from their domestic problems, and all this will get worse. But if China were to have a fundamental economic, political, social upheaval that weakens China, that weakens its ability to fund its Navy and Air Force, then we're in a totally different geopolitical environment. So I'll leave that as a caveat at the end. And now, if I could take just 3 or 5 minutes to talk about something else. I just got back this month from a month in Moldova and Romania, and I got a different look at the Ukrainian crisis that I just like to share some observations. I was there as a journalist, researching a book, and so all I did was listen to people for a month. And the things I heard was Article 5 of NATO protects the former Warsaw Pact and newly NATO states against a Red Army invasion. And Article 5 is meaningless because there will never be a Red Army invasion. NATO does not protect against various forms of subversion, buying off politicians in weak democracies, buying off media, buying up banks and other strategic assets, running intelligence and crime networks. In this world of nonlinear warfare, Gazprom is a more effective tool of traditional Russian imperialism than the Red Army. And so this is one thing I heard. Another thing is in Moldova itself, it looks on the map like a little country. Why did you spend a month there? Well, because it's not a little country. It only looks little on the map. It's actually very vast. In the south, you have ethnic Russian-speaking, Christianized Turks, Christianized Turkic people known as Gagauz, who are completely estranged from the largely ethnic Romanian Moldovan government and are very pro-Russian. They're pro-Russian for historical reasons. Their whole experience through the West has been through Romania, and that means Romania's World War II fascist occupation of this region. So they see Romania is negative, and thus they see the West as negative, and thus they've historically fought on the side of Russia. In the north, you have large amounts of ethnic Russians in Balts and other areas who are also for rational economic reasons pro-Russian. They get all their natural gas from Russia, meaning Russia controls their quality of life, and they sell all their economic produce, their agricultural produce to Russia. Moldovans, it's a hope that Moldovans will get visa-free status into the EU. That means nothing if you're Moldovan because you don't have the money to travel in the EU in the first place. But you do have the money to travel back and forth to Russia, to the Ukraine. So that Russia is a fact of life in Moldova, whereas the West is just an interesting concept in Moldova. And, people have speculated in the media, well, Putin may invade Moldova. He doesn't need to invade Moldova. He's not going to invade Moldova. This is all about winning hearts and minds using soft power, but from a Russian point of view, from a Russian perspective, not from a Western perspective, about influencing countries from within so that there never is a red line. The line is smeared all pink on the page, and you never know when it's been crossed, and there is always arguments about it. I'll stop here and open it up to questions. Thank you very much.
Are we on the record for the Q&A?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Paul, begin.
Robert, thanks very much for a very insightful and clear presentation. I don't think you mentioned India. And could you, the other continental Asian giant, could you apply your geopolitical perspective to Chinese perceptions of and intentions toward India with reference not only to the border, but to what you said earlier about access to the Indian Ocean?
Yes. India and China historically never had much to do with each other. The exceptions were the spread of Buddhism in Middle Antiquity and the Opium Wars, the opium trade in the 19th century, which is a great series of books written about it by Amitav Ghosh. And but what's happened in recent decades is that why did they have very little to do with each other? Because of geography, the high walls of the Karakorums and the Himalayas. But technology has superseded geography. Technology has shrunk distance so that you have Chinese fighter jets in Tibet that can theoretically include India as part of their arc of operations. You have Indian ballistic missiles that can hit Chinese cities. You have Indian space satellites that spy on China. You have Chinese warships in the Indian Ocean. You have Indian warships in the South China Sea. So that India and China, because of a new strategic geography that's been created thanks to technology, are now strategic rivals. I didn't say they're going to war. I just said they're rivals for the first real time in their history. India is uncomfortable with Chinese financing and building of ports all around India. The Chinese say, look, we can never really use these ports for military purposes. We don't intend to. It's purely for commercial purposes. But nevertheless, the Indians and the Chinese are playing a great game of sorts for influence in Sri Lanka, in Bangladesh, and Nepal, and in Myanmar. Each country is offering these smaller countries loans, advantageous credits, military assistance, etc. So these countries are rivals. Now, there's a new Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, who is probably, maybe, I don't know this, but he may emerge as India's first real geopolitically thinking prime minister in its history. When you get beyond Nehruvian socialism and third worldism, Modi has tended to see India in classical geopolitical terms. In other words, he wants to move closer to China as a model for like fast forwarding the Indian economy. But he also wants to balance against China by moving closer to Japan, to Vietnam, to Australia, and ultimately to the United States, where apparently he's going to make a visit in the fall. I did a long interview with Modi in 2008 for The Atlantic, and I can tell you he's one of the most dynamic, charismatic men I've ever met. He is going to make a big splash. I can't predict exactly how, but he's very, very self-willed, willing to take risks, and very determined. So what you may see is a lot of nice handshaking between India and China and announcements of bilateral cooperation, but behind the scenes, there'll be increasingly fierce competition.
May I ask a follow-on a little bit there? Modi is widely regarded as anti-Muslim. Is that a factor in his? I mean, he's got a big fraction of his population is Muslim.
Yeah.
Is that a factor in his ability to coalesce that nation in a really significant way?
It will be a factor. He's perceived as anti-Muslim because of his alleged role in the 2002 riots in Gujarat. This was at the very beginning of Modi's tenure as chief minister. And he may have committed the mistakes he did because he was inexperienced. Things may have gotten out of hand, or it may have been self-willed. There's a big controversy about this. He may seek to overcompensate by trying to move closer to Pakistan deliberately to assuage concerns that he's anti-Muslim. I don't know. He's at the very
That would be
beginning of
smart.
his term, and he's going to want to make a splash.
Yes, sir.
Hi, my name's Andrew Oros from Washington College and at the East-West Center now here in Washington. I read your last book, the South China Sea book. It was really interesting, and I learned so much from that and your talk today. And I'd like to ask a question related to that. I'm a specialist on Japan and Japanese security policy, and so from my point of view, there's a lot of interest in Japan's growing interest in Southeast Asia. And some fear Japan is building big military. Others sort of dismiss that. I guess you're on the more dismissal view since Japan played such a little role in your book on the South China Sea, but maybe things have changed recently. I just wonder your take on that.
No, I'm not in a dismissal point of view. By the way, thank you for what you said. I'm not in a dismissal view. There's very little of the East China Sea, frankly, in the book, because that's not what the book was about. When anyone writes a book, you have to delineate it and decide what you're not going to write about, what you're not going to put in. And I decided to do just a book on the South China Sea. No, I think Japan has quietly been amassing a high-quality, serious military for decades. Japan may have three times as many major warships on the high seas as the British Royal Navy on any given day. It depends on what you consider major warships, depending upon what ships are in port or whatnot. Japan has impressive niche capabilities in special operations forces, in diesel-electric submarines. It's a real deployable military. It's one of the best in the world, perhaps, for its size. And it's a major factor. Now, here's the conundrum for Japan, I would say. Japan, in the eyes of many in Asia, has not properly atoned for its actions in World War II, and therefore does not have the legitimacy to to develop its military as it's doing. But from the Japanese point of view, China really does represent an existential threat, given China's geographical proximity, the size of its population, and just the growth and development of the Chinese Navy, Air Force, ballistic missiles, especially since the mid-1990s. So Japan has a good reason to do what it's doing, but it's distrusted at the same time. And one of its challenges is how to overcome that distrust. And that's why the United States could be in a very uncomfortable position. Because while Japan is its ally and China is its rival, the United States may have to worry as much about its ally as it does about its rival.
Yes, sir.
Mike Macetic, PBS Online News Hour. This has been fascinating. Some of us in the media have been using the word, maybe wrongly, I'd like your view on this, revisionist powers to discuss China and Russia. Do you believe that's an accurate word, or is it a wrong word? And then secondly, now that we're talking about India, is Pakistan the real joker in the international world and trying to predict what's going to happen given their nuclear and their terrorists and they're coming apart, et cetera, et cetera?
All right. I think revisionism is a wrong word because I think a lot of the public who watches your show and others won't know what it means really. They'll be scratching their head. These are powers that want to recover their sense, their geography of dominance, or geography of influence that they lost in recent decades and centuries, to recover their lost glory, so to speak. That's certainly in the case with Russia. You can look at Putin's public statements. It's the case with China in the sense that its actions in the South and East China Sea, the very growth of its military, has to be partly designed to overcome the feeling of humiliation that it's sustained from the early mid-19th century right up until Mao Zedong essentially unified China, however brutally he did so. I don't think India is a revisionist power. Pakistan, it's interesting that you bring up Pakistan. Pakistan now, as we speak, is conducting a very large military offensive in North Waziristan because it's created a Frankenstein monster in the Pakistani Taliban. And now the Taliban inside Pakistan, as opposed to that in Afghanistan, is threatening and embarrassing the Pakistani state. When you can attack with impunity the country's largest airport, the airport that most foreigners come in and out of in order to get to your country, you've been especially embarrassed. But it's unclear what the Pakistanis can do with the Pakistani Taliban. They've never really controlled the northwest frontier territories very well. They've worked with the tribes, who in recent years have become less cooperative. They used to keep peace indirectly through the tribes because government forces wouldn't go there. Now, but in recent years, the tribes have flipped to the sides of the Taliban. So without getting too much into the inside baseball here, I think Pakistan's ultimate future may be dependent on what happens in Afghanistan. And what happens in Afghanistan will be dependent, we'll know a lot more of after U.S. troops complete their substantial drawdown. Remember, we're entering into a period where Afghanistan and Pakistan, for the first time in 13 years, will be more or less devoid of American troops. And there are going to be real changes in that sense.
Jacob, did you have a question?
Yeah. Bob, I want to take you back to your initial remarks about realism, elites, and Washington, D.C. You mentioned Nicholas Spikeman,
Yeah.
called him an American.
Yeah.
Of course, he was
a Dutchman.
Dutchman,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
prompts me to ask, is realism part of the American tradition? Because most of the thinkers that we consider realist, at least in the 20th century, were not really Americans. Henry Kissinger emigrated in his teens. Morgenthau comes over to the University of Chicago. Spikeman at Yale. These are the guys
And
who helped
Brzezinski.
set the Cold War geostrategic lineaments
Yeah.
of American power. At the same time, you tell us that the bureaucracy in D.C. is populated with people who think more or less like my friend and colleague Paul Pillar. That is, they are pretty realist in their outlook. At the same time, in our very elite consensus, we have both the liberal hawks and the neoconservatives pounding Obama for allegedly having more in common, as David Rothkopf put it, with Rand Paul than he does with mainstream America. So what's your take ultimately on these different trends and factions in American foreign policy?
I think realism is Americans as a people are uncomfortable with let me start this again. Americans are good people. They want there to be peace in Central Africa. They want there to be peace in the Balkans. They don't want dictators to take over here and there. They would like to end a civil war in Syria. They're not heartless people who just move pieces on a chessboard. But the public, at the same time, because of America's geography, separated by two oceans, with so much going on internally that's fascinating to this moment that gets so little coverage in the media, Americans set a very high bar in terms of what are the criteria for sustained military intervention anywhere. They want to see an obvious, demonstrable threat to their national interest that you can explain in a 15-second soundbite or so. Let me give you an example. When the United States went into Somalia in 1992, I think there was 90% public approval for doing so, because they didn't want to see kids starve. But the moment 17 or so Marines, I forget the exact number, were killed brutally in Mogadishu, suddenly the public flipped and said, what are we doing there? In other words, humanitarian reasons often will be enough to get the U.S. involved overseas, because the American public are good people. But the minute you start to take casualties, the public wants to see, they want to see decisive, easily communicable reasons why we're there for our own naked self-interest. So the American people are not philosophically realists. They couldn't make arguments like Brzezinski or Kissinger or so, and they're uncomfortable with the heartless side of realism. But at the same time, they're really not willing to make sacrifices of a great scale unless they absolutely have to. So that realism fits nicely, I would say realism sort of explained in an idealistic formulation really fits nicely with the American public. But even realists have to talk idealistically, because or else the public becomes, it becomes alienated, I think.
You forgot Robert Strauss-Hupé.
Yes, sir. Over here.
Bob, Dick Solomon, Duran. I'm trying to reconcile your very, very helpful geographical perspective on China's security dilemma. That is a sea frontier, but their traditional threats from their northern frontier, their ethnic problems on their west, etc., with what in fact they are doing today. You could, because the Chinese general you cited, or admiral, I forget which, who said, well, you did whatever you did back in the late 19th, early 20th century in the Caribbean. Why can't we do it today in our region? We're living in the 21st century. And what the Chinese are doing, in my view, certainly along their sea frontier, is provoking the kind of negative reaction, certainly from the Japanese and these other countries, who really aren't interested in a reestablishment of the kind of Chinese hegemony over the region that is their historical pattern. And so, and this is a question that tomorrow I think the Chinese ambassador is going to be here. It's really a question for him. Why do you see us as an adversary when, as Kissinger said to Zhou Enlai, you don't want a neutral Japan, you want us welded to Japan because we constrain them, we fought 2 wars against Japan. Do you really want to take on the Japanese today? So I see the Chinese policies as really self-destructive right now, because they're producing a polarization. They're going to put strains on their economic relations with the region when they need more time to develop their economy. So how would you explain? Is their thinking stuck in their classical view of their role as the regional hegemon?
All right, when you're talking about motivations, ambassadors, officials will never tell you the truth. Because they have to talk in a language that's helpful for their diplomacy. So you have to kind of look at what is their domestic situation, what is their geographical situation, what is their historical situation. Keep in mind that we tend to think that only democratically elected leaders care about public opinion. Well, my experience has always been that dictators care very much about public opinion. In some cases more so than democratically elected leaders. And China's rulers have sustained, support for their one-party state by delivering high GDP growth rates for 2 decades or 3 decades or so. Those growth rates are coming down. And China may be appealing more to nationalism because if you look at it, given the increase in this, the steady drum roll of increase in the size of the Chinese Navy and military in general, at a much higher pace than the increase of the Vietnamese Navy, the other navies in East Asia, certainly in terms of, with the U.S. military budget plateauing, you would think that the best policy for the Chinese is to do nothing. Don't initiate anything that might be an incident in the South China or East China Sea. Just gradually accrue military power, and over the space of 15 years or so, everyone will wake up one day and just see how the Chinese dominate the region. And they will also seduce and allure many of the other countries in East Asia to not be as close to the Americans, because after all, the Chinese aren't a threat. So China seems, from one point of view, to be acting against its interests by doing all these things in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. My own view is that they're doing it to appease public opinion at a time when economic growth rates are declining and will probably decline even further, because public opinion can be more nationalistic and more intolerable than the opinion of elites, even if those elites are not elected.
Holly Barnes.
Chuck, Dimitri wants to
Look at him.
A point on that strategy you were just describing of slowly over time accumulating more and more space, whether it's psychologically or literally taking more of that space over, you said 15 years, so that the dominance, people wake up and one day see their dominance in the seas. It makes me wonder if it really is in our interest to, and I'd like your opinion on whether it's in our interest to go ahead and respond to that weak institutionalized state of the Philippines that you spoke about. Is it in our interest to go ahead and work on strengthening those institutions and building up that governance capacity in light of what you've just described, the strategy of sort of spreading quietly?
I think from my visits to the Philippines, and I've made several, and talks obviously with U.S. officials, we're doing that. Our military is embracing the Filipino military, trying to build it up, make it get stronger. Even though we were ejected from Clark and Subic in '92, we have essentially moved back into the Philippines, though on a rotational basis, so we don't officially have bases there. The Philippines currently has arguably the best president that it's had in decades, in Benigno Aquino. And so there's a real chance for progress to be made. But at the same time, we're not going to change this in 3 or 5 years. This is a generational undertaking. What the Philippines wants, and which we may be delivering, is just more U.S. presence in the in the Spratlys, in the South China Sea, because U.S. presence, warship presence, in and of itself can dissuade China. And dissuading China means the possibility of fewer incidents and then fewer catastrophes along the way.
Our president,
I think it really was a brilliant
Dimitri.
presentation. There was one point where I think it would be useful for us to be reassured that you meant exactly what you meant. Namely, you don't see much danger of war, if I understood you correctly. Because you said something very significant. You talked about the role of public opinion in dictatorships. You also talked about the role of nationalism, both in China and Russia. You did not quite describe them as revisionist powers, but clearly you suggested that they have ambitions going beyond the current situation. Before I came to
bring it
your
in
meeting-
there. Is everybody able to hear that back there?
Before I came to your meeting, I read
Dimitri, grab that.
a statement by a prominent person on Russian TV yesterday. And this deity Jew should run back to his Tel Aviv before he would be accountable for the slaughter of the Russian people in Ukraine. The name of this deity Jew is Vladimir Putin. there is clearly a growing monster of Russian nationalism.
Yeah.
And we're awakening it without giving it very much thought.
Yeah.
Now, with all these ambitions, with what you just told us about Romania and how people believe in the magic force of Article 5.
They don't believe. Yeah, yeah.
Some people, clearly.
Right, yeah.
If you listen, for instance, to the polls, they seem to believe in its magic powers, the historians do. So my question is very simple, but actually it's a very complex issue in my mind. If you talk about the possibility of war too much, it paralyzes your decision making and you're unable to do what needs to be done. And that's not helpful. And Churchill have reminded everybody about that a number of times very effectively. If you totally dismiss the possibility of war, then you ignore very serious and intended consequences of your actions. So where do you stand on this dilemma?
In East Asia, there's nothing in my book that makes a prediction for a major war, though I do say repeatedly that because in a more crowded, complex seascape of more and more sea and air platforms, the possibility of incidents goes up dramatically. And incidents here and there can lead to a spiraling upward of military conflicts. So the possibility of war is greater, but that's not the key takeaway that I'm making. The key takeaway is the 21st century may be no more stable than previous centuries, that it's going to be a crowded, nervous, more complicated world, and where you will have fierce geopolitical competition, but it need not necessarily lead to major war. And let me just make a point that I didn't make during the talk, is that technology does not negate geography. It just makes it more precious and claustrophobic, so that territory means more to people than it used to, rather than less. Russia and Europe is a different story. I think that that Putin will do everything in his power to avoid a conflict with the West from his point of view. And therefore, they are more likely to use subversion rather than overt military troops. I think that because using troops it's risky, it's expensive, it leads to sanctions. Buying off politicians and buying up banks, and particularly buying up media over the years so you can gradually change the public opinion climate in a place like Odessa, that can succeed without incurring sanctions. Because you have, as someone said, it's not plausible deniability, it's implausible deniability, but nevertheless it's denied.
Okay, this gentleman right here.
Hi, I'm James Kitfield from National Journal. I always find your talks on geography and its influence on geopolitics insightful, and this is no exception. If we were having this discussion 10 years ago and contemplating what could bring us and China into conflict, Taiwan would be first on our list. And it's the dog that's not barking. I'm just curious, in your book, do you address why that is so, and what are the implications of Taiwan and China seem to have found some sort of an accommodation in recent years, and is that likely to last?
It's an accommodation, but one that leads perhaps inexorably to China's making an end run around Taiwanese sovereignty, and that Taiwan becoming part of China, part of a greater China. China has thousands or close to 2,000 ballistic missiles aimed at Taiwan. But at the same time, there are hundreds of flights every week between Taiwan and the mainland, commercial flights. So that the two countries' economies and peoples are moving closer, while China increases the military threat. And there may come a point, Rand did a study, I think in 2009, it was, questioned, criticized, but it was very, and it said under certain circumstances by, I think 2020, the United States will not be able to militarily defend Taiwan. The way things are going. The key thing to watch for is not will not for China to invade Taiwan or decide not to. The key thing to watch is a change in perceptions. Will there come an invisible point beyond which Taiwan is not assumed to be credibly defended by the United States? And once that happens, then you can have a shift in alliance relationships, everywhere from Japan to Australia, as the U.S. is perceived to be weaker.
You struck my fancy with a description of this National Museum in Taipei, in which Chang and his folks had brought out a lot of the great relics and historic pieces of art and what have you as they were leaving. And your last sentence, I want you to react to. This museum is a political statement that by virtue of our possession of these objects, we in Taiwan are the real China, and we will change the mainland before the mainland changes us.
Yes, I had an excerpt run at the time the book was published, saying that in the long, long run, Chiang Kai-shek may turn out to be the more influential Chinese leader than Mao Zedong, because Mao's economic governing philosophy it was a disaster, essentially. Chiang Kai-shek may not have been the perfect ruler. He was a ruthless autocrat, but as several books show, his warlord years were born more of necessity than outright cruelty, and that nobody could have done better than he did during that period. And in the early years in Taiwan, he may have been a ruthless autocrat, but he paved the way for land reform and ultimately for Taiwanese democracy, which is one of the more model democracies, young democracies in the world. So by any historical standard, if you think of a more liberalized, more unwieldy but greater China decades into the future, Chiang might become more of an avatar than Mao. It's something interesting. It's something interesting to contemplate. And what's also interesting to contemplate is both men officially are dictators. Mao was a dictator, Chiang Kai-shek was a dictator. But Mao was a dictator who killed tens of millions of people. Chiang Kai-shek was a dictator who paved the way for one of the world's most model young democracies.
Ambassador Jerry Bremer's back here, and he has a question, I think.
You used an interesting term when you talked about Finlandizing East Asia as a Chinese objective, perhaps. Two questions. Is there a difference between Finlandizing and hegemony? And if so, what are the measure points at which we would see the Chinese were going beyond Finlandizing to hegemony, or are they the same thing? Secondly, more importantly, is a Finlandized East Asia in America's interest? Can we tolerate that, or hegemonic if that's the next phase?
I think Finlandization is a cheap, effective form of imperialism. Finlandization worked in Finland because of Finland's long border with the Soviet Union. I mean, that's what allowed for Finlandization in the first place. When you look at the geography of Southeast Asia, it's not as contiguous to China as Finland was to the Soviet Union. But if China were to gain dominance on some future morrow in the South China Sea, well, then it would be, in a way, contiguous. So I would call Finlandization a soft form of hegemony, so to speak. Can we live with a Finlandized Southeast Asia? Well, this is where the debate in America between realists, neo-isolationists, and others, gets interesting. Because some would argue, well, who cares? America's not going to go to war for Vietnam, or for Malaysia, for that matter. On the other hand, it's worthwhile to think about the fact that tens of millions of people depend upon their independence and freedom in Southeast Asia as well as in Northeast Asia because ultimately of American military power projection, not in the form of boots on the ground, but in the form of warships on the high seas and air platforms that the United States has sustained with broad public support for decades.
I have a hand back here.
Bob Merritt, National Interest. Well, let me pursue that, Robert, because the analogy between China and the South China Sea and America and the Caribbean is very interesting, and obviously it's in the minds of a lot of Chinese. But when the United States was consolidating its position in the Caribbean, it had only two significant challengers. One was Spain, which was a corrupt and dying empire. The other was the Brits, which after the Venezuelan crisis of 1896 pretty much said we're not going to be going up against Americans anymore. All for 100 years they've been trying to thwart us in our expansion, and they basically said no more. So we didn't really have any competitor once we decided that we were going to make that an American lake. The situation in China is much different, and I think that really raises the question of how America sees its position in Asia. You're talking about a naval presence, but ultimately a naval presence has to be backed up if questions of who's going to dominate arise. And so it seems to me that there's a little bit of a disconnect between the description that you're giving of the chaos or the destabilized situation in Asia and your somewhat more optimistic view that isn't likely to lead to war.
Yeah. All right. Of course, Teddy Roosevelt, when he was president, was not afraid of a weak Spain, and he was, friendly with Britain. He began to get very much afraid of the Kaiser's Germany, perhaps moving into the Caribbean. So he wanted a stronger Caribbean policy because Spain was one thing, Imperial Germany was something else entirely. So the United States was was worried about a strong European power trying to gain inroads into the Caribbean, not a weak and dying one, as you put it. China, as you say, faces a different situation. It faces real resistance in the forms of countries that may not be as capable as a European country or as capable as Japan, but certainly are stronger than these weak Caribbean polities of the day. But the fact that it encounters resistance doesn't mean it's any less determined. It doesn't mean that they're any less committed to what they see as their historical rights. Now, if you ask the Chinese ambassador tomorrow, do you have a Caribbean policy in the South China Sea? I'm sure he'll say, well, that's nonsense. We never even think about it. But I would say that comparisons are more interesting for what they reveal than for the small inaccuracies in them. I think when you look at the Caribbean and you look at the South China Sea and you look at it vis-a-vis the U.S., vis-a-vis China, there's a lot of similarities.
Yes, we have the Deputy Chief of Mission of Japan here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very informative discussion. And my name is Hiroyasu Izumi, Deputy Chief of Mission of Japanese Embassy. My question is very simple. That is, how do you see the present Chinese leadership, strong or weak? Xi Jinping is strong enough to carry out its consistent, long-standing geopolitical strategy in both East China and the South China Sea, step by step changing the status quo, or so vulnerable as to appease public opinion for his leadership? Thank you.
I think that he's a new leader It's widely perceived that his predecessor, Hu Jintao, wasted 10 years in power when he could have been doing economic reform but didn't. So he saddled this new regime with a lot of difficult things it has to do. And even making the right decisions on the economy entail risks, and it means, you know, making the public uneasy and nervous. So I think he's trying to take control of China's nationalist impulses in a public opinion climate. He's from a position of strength rather than weakness. I see him as, you know, it was very interesting, I thought, Mrs. Obama's visit to China, where she met with Xi Jinping and spent time with Xi Jinping's wife. Because what was that all about? It was partly about personalizing the Chinese president. Chinese presidents in the past did not have attractive wives like Xi Jinping has, or elegant-looking wives. They did not. Their wives were not in public like this president's is. This is a much more of a leader who, stepping out of the gray collegiality of all the leaders since Mao, more or less, is trying to cut a very personalized profile for himself. And I think that goes along with anti-corruption, economic reform, and fierce nationalism in the adjacent seas. They all kind of merge together. And the bumper sticker for them all is dynamism. You know, I'm taking China in a more forceful direction. I'm not just going to let time pass by like my predecessor did.
You provoke me, as you always seem to do, as you talked about Chiang Kai-shek and what's maybe revisionism now, but with looking at him with cold facts and particularly a longer view of history, he paved the way for a move toward a truly democratic society, unlike Mao. And it just searching my own memory a little bit, it seems to me that, at least in modern times, power rarely concedes willingly. But the two prominent so-called right-wing dictators in modern times that have voluntarily prepared their societies and moved them into democracies have both been right-wing, not left-wing dictators. Francisco Franco in Spain and Augusto Pinochet in Chile. What is it about this? What does that prompt in you? Why do left-wing dictators want to hang on to it and maybe right-wing?
Well, I believe Jeane Kirkpatrick dealt with this decades ago in a famous article, in that communist dictators wanted to control everything, including the economy. You know, they were totalizing. Whereas right-wing dictators often let a lot of normal capitalist activity just happen and go along. So it was easier for them to cede power. Also, right-wing dictators didn't always have a fascist ideology. They were reactionaries like Salazar in Portugal, Franco in Spain. They may have been only technically fascist, but ideology was weak for them. Whereas ideology for someone like Mao was extremely, was at the center of who they were, how they defined themselves.
Well, listen, you have brought enlightenment to us today, and an interesting presentation, and we thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Will you come back again?
Certainly.